Good evening, everybody. I'm Catlin Morgan, Education Manager for Institute on Aging. Welcome to another Age On Authors event offered by IOA. We are an organization devoted to helping older and disabled adults stay independent for as long as possible through an assortment of home-based services, including our new dementia service, Compania. You can learn more about all of our services at www.ioaging.org or call our Connect line at 415-750-4111. We'd like to thank tonight's guests, Dr. Leslie Kernisan and Paula Spencer-Scott, for this presentation based on their book, When Your Aging Parent Needs Help. We will be placing a recording of this on our YouTube channel within the week. Geriatrician Leslie Kernisan is the founder of the website and podcast Better Health While Aging, and I will put information in the chat feature about that website. And she also has the Helping Older Parents online programs. Her focus is helping older adults and their families manage late life health challenges. She's the author of the book you're going to hear about tonight, and she is UCSF trained in internal medicine, geriatrics, and healthcare quality improvement, and has a private geriatrics consultation practice and is the clinical instructor in the Division of Geriatrics at UCSF. She's a former site medical director for the Over 60 Health Center in Berkeley, and she lives in San Francisco. And with her tonight is Paula Spencer-Scott, an award-winning writer and editor on health and aging. She's the co-author, well, they're both the authors tonight, and her other books include collaborations with doctors at UCLA, Harvard, Duke, Arizona State, and a series of interactive journals. She's been a healthcare correspondent for Parade. Her articles have also appeared in Next Avenue, AARP Bulletin, Woman's Day, where she was a columnist for 10 years, and many other national media. A longtime caregiving advocate, she often speaks on helping families deal with dementia and on brain health. And she lives in Colorado. So welcome to the time zone over here on the West Coast, Paula, and I will turn it over to you. I will unpin myself now.
Okay, well, thank you, Caitlin, and hello to everyone on behalf of Dr. Leslie and I. I have a few slides prepared to kind of as we talk along through the book. So this is the cover of the book that just came out earlier this year, and we're going to go through kind of the greatest hits and highlights about what's in it. So I'm talking first, but I'm not a doctor here. I'm not a nurse. I'm not a social worker. I am someone who has lived this material several times over, including a father who had dementia, a mother who died of cancer. And in fact, when she died before my father, we suddenly discovered the extent to which he had dementia, and all the adult children had to chime in and start to take over his care. Also had a live-in father-in-law who had a form of frontotemporal dementia, along with a few random other relatives. And so I know that experience, and that what Dr. Leslie and I sometimes call the uh-oh moment of, uh-oh, what's going on here? Things aren't quite the same, and you're not really sure what to do next. So I'm not a medical professional, but I'm a professional asker of questions and getter of answers. I've been a health journalist for multiple decades now, and I specialize in translating kind of the medicalese into information that will help lay people. My experiences with elder care and all the things that I learned about Alzheimer's began at the one of the first big elder care websites, which is where I met Dr. Leslie when she was a medical director there, and we collaborated on a number of projects, including one of them was I wrote a book called Surviving Alzheimer's, which is practical tips and soul-saving wisdom for caregivers, trying to harness all that kind of information that I was learning at the website, and interviewed Dr. Kernisan for it. We then collaborated on a number of articles and other kinds of projects together, and really had a good working relationship. I love I've talked to all kinds of doctors all the time, and I love the doctors who are super passionate about their material and also have something kind of innovative and fresh to say about it. And that kind of has carried through a lot of the work that we've done. So I thought that the format that maybe that we could use today is I'll put my journalist hat on and ask Dr. Kernisan some questions as we lead along and work through the slides. And really, the first one that I think everyone should know is asking you, what drives this focus on helping adult children in particular with their aging parents. I know you also help adults themselves, but this focus on people like me is really kind of a unique niche. So I'll let you maybe talk a little bit about your experiences.
Okay, well, thank you, Paula, and thank you, Caitlin, for inviting us. And thank you to all of you who are here with us today. So I'm kind of curious, for those of you who are here, maybe tell us in the chat, how many of you are currently concerned about an older parent or involved in the care of an older parent? You can go ahead and say yes in the chat and let us know. I always love to know sort of who's with us. Okay, so we have several yeses. Okay, well, wonderful. So one of my goals for today is for you to take away with some very specific ideas of how to hopefully help you with your aging parent, whether or not you end up interested in the book. But a little bit about me. So yes, I am passionate about geriatrics, my specialty, which I think of as the art and science of modifying healthcare so that it works better for older adults and families. And starting off in medical school, I was really interested in primary care because I was interested in the whole person and the bigger picture of somebody's health. And as a medical resident at UCSF, I was interested in who needs this the most. And it's the ones who are older, actually. They are the ones where it's medically most challenging to balance all their conditions. But also, it's a really rich time in terms of connections to other people. And it kind of occurred to me that similar to pediatrics, and we have a lot in common with pediatrics, an earlier life stage where the family is so integral to the health and well-being of the person, that late in life, you could also see, I mean, everybody in life, we're all social creatures embedded with our families and friends who influence us and support us in our health and affect us. But it becomes really important late in life. And so that was really interesting to me, how those caregiving relationships developed, the role that family members were playing. They were really important to us as geriatricians. I mean, often as my patients got frailer or sicker, they were really depending on a spouse or on an adult child. And I felt that was really interesting. So the other thing I found I was passionate about was educating people. It was my favorite part of the doctor-patient encounter, helping older adults understand more about what was happening with their health and involving them and helping their families. But I also noticed that there was this moment where, sometimes the children would kind of pull at my sleeve in the hallway and say, I need to tell you something about my parents. And so I got quite interested in that. And then from a quality perspective, we know so much in geriatrics about helping older adults and their families, but most of the healthcare system is not applying what we know. And we don't have enough geriatricians. So I was also interested in the question of, well, since there aren't enough of us to work one-on-one with each older person in each family, how do you make what we know available to more people? And so when I, in 2008, ran into a colleague actually of Paula's at the new website for boomers worried about aging parents. And they said, would you like to answer questions from people worried about aging parents? I said, yes, I would love to. And I started answering questions and felt like, well, I have found my calling. So I am no longer with that site, but I'm still collaborating with Paula and ended up starting my own site, Better Health While Aging, where I write articles. And then I did become especially interested in the question of how to help an aging parent and how to get started. So Paula, I forget, is the next slide about specifically that question?
Yeah, when they're tugging on your sleeve, what were you hearing from families? Because I've heard it too, but I know you've heard it in countless clinical settings. What were they that led to the genesis of the book?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I think as you put here, right, it's a life stage full of unanswered questions. So first I noticed that people would start off asking me questions like, well, my mom's very old and she lives alone and I don't think she should. So when should she move, or can she still live alone? And I thought, well, it's really not about her age. It's about, first of all, how is she doing? And second of all, what does she want? So I felt like, well, it depends. It depends on, are there signs that she's actually slipping mentally or physically? Are there, like, real safety issues cropping up? Are there signs that she's having difficulty managing her healthcare? Her healthcare is very complicated. So it started with that, and I ended up creating a little cheat sheet, quick start guide to checking it, which was based on what I would think about as a geriatrician to start to consider that. And then we would often get a question at Better Health While Aging, which, let me see, I wrote it here. It was things like, our widowed mother is 78 and lives alone. She won't go to a doctor or complete a power of attorney or use a medical alert. We've explained it to her over and over why she should accept more help, but she's refusing. And so what do we do? And so there too, I thought, well, again, it's kind of, it depends. It depends on, does it look like she's mentally slipping? Have you talked to her to find out more about what she wants and how she sees it? Are you kind of putting on, your preferences for how you think she should live her life? And so I thought, well, this is a really interesting time when people first start on this journey of shifting into a role of helping, and what's the right way to help. And it depends a bit on the situation of the parent, and what the parent wants, and also on how significant things are. So that was kind of the genesis of the book, because it was more than I could write about in an article for Better Health While Aging. But I felt like, well, there's a process that I often go through, and we had started to coach people on it in the Helping Older Parents programs online. And then I talked to Paula, and we thought, what if we put it into a book? So I guess, Paula, what are the kinds of questions that you've heard from people often?
Yeah, I mean, I've listed a bunch of them on the slide. What is happening and what do I do? It's sort of that freeze moment. So you're either all in, people just, want to jump in and you want to solve a problem, right? So you want to jump in and take action. So what do I do? And is it something about a power of attorney? Is it something, you just really don't know. It's a life stage that you haven't encountered yet. And
I felt like also there was also, why won't they listen? Why won't they do this thing that is obviously the right thing?
Yeah.
Right.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about, so what are the other like common, the buckets of things that sort of the mistakes that tend to make. And I call them the well-intentioned mistakes, because of course the best of intentions.
Yeah, so this is usually coming from a space of concern and caring and wanting the best for our older parent, and fear, I think, of what if they get hurt, what if things get worse, what if we're not doing everything we should for them, what if they're not doing everything that they should for them. Yeah, a couple like really common mistakes that I noticed people were making. So one is, trying to get the parent to make changes before having carefully listened to them. And I even saw this come up with COVID. Actually, when COVID came out, lots of people would write to us and say, my parent isn't following the precautions. They're not wearing a mask or washing their hands or going out. And I would start off by saying to people, well, have you talked to your parent and found out how they see the situation and what are their concerns about the pandemic? And people would say, oh, actually, maybe not yet. So I feel like, often it's in, the simple things. And nobody should feel bad if they realize they haven't listened enough, because we're all really busy and, and often are juggling this with other things. But I think that's a really common mistake, is to try to take action before you've learned enough. And the listening does, two things. One is, it's to understand really how they see it and what matters to them. But the other thing is, I think the listening is also a really important part of getting a sense of, are they mentally slipping or not? Or certainly for me, whenever I hear that an older person is not doing what other people think they should, I think, well, there must be more of a story to that. Let me find out how that older person sees it. But I also think, well, is part of the reason why they're not doing this related to developing a memory or thinking problem? Because if it is, that's important to know, because then the considerations of whether to step in if they're reluctant, or how to work with them are going to be a little different. So I would say that's like one really common mistake, is to jump in too soon trying to change things.
And even if you think that they have memory problems, that it's a step that you should take, you still should have that discussion, the sort of
Yes.
respect.
Yeah, absolutely. Because what you learn from it, you'll later be able to use once it is time to try to step in. So I generally emphasize, like, don't try to jump in and do something right away. Start by listening, and then later, you'll plot out an approach for what seems to be a good way to step in.
Mhm.
So, and then another really common mistake that that I see people making is that, well, my parents said, they don't want any help, and so there's nothing to do. So I've heard that very often, and people post this on the site. Well, I've been told that if they're refusing help, there is nothing to do. So the reason why I feel like this is a mistake is, and again, it's an extension of geriatrics. In geriatrics, we have lots of patients who initially are, reluctant or refusing, but there are always things to do. So, for instance, one thing to do is potentially listen a little bit more, stop the pushing, and open it up to tell me a little bit more. I would love to understand. Or there might be other ways to present some options that might go over better. And then the other thing is, again, it comes to this question of, are they mentally slipping? Because if it does look like people are mentally slipping enough, then it becomes, ethically more permissible to insist, and eventually legally more permissible to insist also. So, so no, you're not necessarily going to be able to get done the thing that you wanted for them right away, but there is always something to do. It just may not be what you thought initially was the thing.
And then this is my favorite one, because I had never really thought about it before until we started to work on this. Should you describe what that means?
Yeah, so another really common mistake, I would say, is people just taking on a lot of responsibility, having the feeling that it's their job to get their parent perfectly safe and perfectly well. And I think, Paula, we were talking about this recently, that we read in some article that many adult children sort of take on this role of being the self-appointed protector of their parents. And I think that's a mistake, because again, it's a little bit of a dance and feeling out to understand, is it, what does your parent want and need? And what is the right way to step in? And especially if people actually are not mentally slipping, they do have the right to make decisions that that we don't like, to live their life in ways that are riskier than we would like. For aging adults, often autonomy is much more important than safety, whereas the typical idea is that for adult children, safety is paramount. They may not get all the healthcare that you wish they would, or exercise the way you wish they would. And so I think we're an action-oriented culture in general. And again, I think this comes from a really caring spot of wanting the best for our parents. But I think ultimately, I do think of this as a journey that most families go on, and that you, as adult children, are going to accompany your parent on this journey of this later stage in their life where their abilities are changing, and they have to make adaptations to that. And that is, that is part of the aging journey. And your job is not so much to get them to the perfect outcome that you want for them, or maybe even that they want for themselves, but to really walk with them in a thoughtful way. So, so sometimes I think just changing people's frame from, it's not that you have to fix everything, it's that you can connect with them and make efforts, and whether those pan out or not are partly going to be a question of your parents, or even whether the healthcare system and social service system cooperates, because unfortunately it's often not really well equipped to make it easy for older adults to get the healthcare and the long-term care supports that we want for them.
So you're saying that a lot of the frustration and hard feelings that often go with, people want to help parents, that it's actually avoidable to a certain extent. Would you say a large extent?
Well, I don't know about large, because it's never easy to see your parent declining or not taking advantage of things that, could benefit them. Right. I mean, I think that's often going to be hard. But what I've seen over the years in coaching families is that once we help people reframe that, it's not that you have to get them to this perfect place, it's that you have to accompany them, thoughtfully. And so maybe you don't get them exactly what you wanted for them, or sometimes they don't get what they want for themselves. I mean, what we know is the vast majority of older adults will say they want to keep living in their homes until they die. And sometimes that's possible, and sometimes that is not, despite all our best efforts, but that we can still, again, the listening. There are ways to listen and connect. And often when we're so focused on getting an outcome, we're actually missing that opportunity to help our older parent feel listened to and connected, and to help them feel that what was important to them was like seen and acknowledged by their adult children.
Yeah, let's talk about that approach, because communication is such a huge part of it, especially the first part. I didn't put a slide together on this, but in the book, we organize the chapters into kind of three main parts. So one is called taking stock, and a lot of that is communication techniques and approaches. The second part is taking aim. It's getting your roadmap together for knowing where you want to go. And then the third part is taking action, right? And then getting going and what you actually do. And each one of those parts, it's really incredible to me how communication, the thing we either take for granted or forget about, is really so important. So maybe let's start with we'll run through. We have 6 steps that the process that you use is kind of organized into, and maybe you could talk a little bit about each one of them, but maybe starting with why taking stock, like why, like back up, stop, and why is the starting place that is
yeah. So so this book I envision for people who are really kind of at the beginning of like trying to figure out how to help a parent who up to then has not been getting a lot of assistance from their adult children, because I felt like that's often a particularly sticky moment for people, where I wanted to help people address the question of, well, is something really going on? Are there real signs of trouble? How important is it to start stepping in? What should we be doing or trying to get done if we get involved? And just more broadly, what are the better ways to support an aging parent through late life challenges? So when I tried to work out on paper the process and framework, and Paula was very helpful to me in figuring out this taking stock, taking aim, taking action. So he said, step 1 is to collect the facts, because again, when people would come to me and say, well, I'm really worried about my mom, I don't think she should be living alone anymore. My answer as a geriatrician is, well, what specifically are you observing, right? And here's what I would check for if I made a house call, to start getting my sense of, does it look like this older person really is starting to struggle with their ability to live independently, right? Their ability to shop, to manage their transportation, their finances, their driving, getting dressed, getting around the house, things that in my line of work we call activities of daily living and instrumental activities of daily living. So, so we had that as a first step, because again, depending on how many problems we see, that would help, me as a geriatrician. And the goal is not that the book will make you a geriatrician, but that you'll end up with better information to then bring to experts who can help you. And we talk about like who to bring what information to, but it's really helpful when people can take their sense that something's not good enough or wrong and turn it into some specifics. So that is why we said that, step one, as part of taking stock was get some facts. And so in our book, we include cheat sheets, like if you're worried about their memory or thinking, specific signs you can look for, and then also specific signs that the older person is starting to struggle with some important life tasks. And I think we also have like a checklist of like the most important safety things that, we think signal that it's more important to get involved. Because again, early on, part of the question is, so, is it that I'm going to have to accept that my things aren't that bad and my parent is just living in a way that's not what I want for them, right? In which case you kind of need to work on yourself. Or is it, wow, actually, now that I've looked, there are all these signs that things are actually really slipping. And so we are going to have to find a way to get involved or get some more help.
And there's facts, and then there's perceptions, which are both equally important.
Yeah, so that was our other part of taking stock, was, like both specific things to observe and then having those conversations, those listening conversations with your parent, which are to understand, how they see things, whether that's about the specific thing you were concerned about. So if you've been concerned about their driving, rather than sitting down with launching a list of what you've noticed and what you're concerned, you could mention like one thing. I noticed there was a dent, tell me about that. How have you, had any, lots of people at your age start to feel that driving's getting difficult. Have you, had any concerns like that? And again, these are things that I do in my geriatrics practice, is if I've heard that someone's memory might be slipping or having a difficulty, I usually start off by telling them, lots of people as they get older feel like their memory's not what it used to be. Have you noticed that? And just see how they see it. And it's also an opportunity to find out, for their life in general. What do they think is going well? What are they concerned about? What are they concerned about? What's most interesting to them right now? What matters the most? The more we learn about how they see it and what matters to them, that puts us in a better position to later help them in a way that is meaningful to them. And also they just feel better about the person who's asking for their perspective. So they'll feel better about you. And when you don't know how much time has left, what can be more important than finding ways to connect?
Yeah, people really, anyone likes to be heard, which is such a big part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the better grasp. And in the book, we actually give a lot of scripts and questions, and sort of, it depends on your family and your conversation style, but a lot of prompts to get the conversation started.
And also some suggestions if you think their memory has been slipping. So don't say, do you remember? Don't try to explain over and over again. And don't look too wigged out if they say something that sounds a little, nutty or crazy. I mean, the idea is to really understand, like, what is my parent's reality?
Yes, that's a really great insight, because that's information too. They say that is alarming to you. You don't have to let on that, but it's all information, whether it's whatever form that it takes. So once you have a better grasp of the situation, then we move to the part in the book we talk about taking aim, sort of getting your roadmap in order, and talk about why it's important to understand certain medical and legal issues, even if you're not a doctor or a lawyer, right at the outset.
Yeah. So I think it seemed to me that in general, if you want to help your parent, before trying to do something, it might be useful to sort of learn more about, ideally for an older person who seems to be declining in independence or declining with their memory or thinking or cognitively, like what would be the ideal next steps? Because, in geriatrics and elder care, we actually, have a framework for what are the ideal next steps, that usually the person, should get both a medical evaluation. So when older adults are declining in independence or starting to show worrisome signs, there is usually an underlying health or medical issue that is affecting their abilities. Now, supporting them, usually can't be solved only with the medical side. It requires, bringing in the right type of supports to enable them to sort of live their best or hopefully improve. But there is, usually a need for a medical evaluation. But also, it's possible to have people come to the home and, identify like specific things they need help with, and hopefully negotiate with them and help them accept some of them, or, agree on what might be done. So, so I felt that I wanted people to understand what the ideal would look like. And then I also wanted them to understand why it's often hard to attain that ideal so that they could start working towards pieces of it depending on what seemed available and feasible in their situation. So, in conceiving the book, we decided, well, we're going to help people understand what it would look like ideally, why it's often hard to accomplish that, and then we'll give them a framework for picking some specific next steps. So in that section, we just talk about a lot of what you can advocate for or look for and see if it's available.
And that's really relieving. It's like, it's not like you have to do, here's your laundry list of 20,000 things that you have to do that you never, can do. But it's like, here's the direction to be aiming in. And then right up front, Dr. Leslie's always saying, this is hard. You won't be able to do all of these things, but it's important and reassuring actually to know kind of what direction you're going in. And the medical part is part of it, but talk about why it's good to know some legal fundamentals as well.
Yeah, so often part of what gets in the way of achieving the ideal is the question is, first of all, whether your parent is cooperating or not, and the question of whether they have the mental capacity to make their decisions about whether to cooperate or not. So we do have a chapter where we talk about this concept of decisional capacity. And again, the idea is not to enable the reader to make a determination about their parent. But people sometimes think that whether somebody has decision-making capacity, this used to be called being mentally competent, is just something that's defined by the courts. The courts do have a role, usually when things have gone pretty dire and the person has ended up in court, but it is something that actually healthcare providers consider, that the lawyers are supposed to consider, and that we can generally consider when there's when they're refusing things, when the question is, well, like, even though they're reluctant, how much do we push, or maybe go ahead and tell their doctor something, even though we have the feeling that they wouldn't want us to. That does relate to the question of, do we think they really understand what's happening and the risks that they are undergoing? So we brought it up for that. The other reason is when people tell me they want to start helping their parent who's having difficulty with finances, or especially if their parent is slipping, then one thing that I always want to know is, well, has your parent completed any power of attorney documents for healthcare or for general affairs? And if they have, do those require, are those active immediately or only when they're incapacitated? So just about in every state, so powers of attorney documents are state by state, but they're usually fairly similar. And in every state, the person completing it gets to say, my agent can act for me right away, or only when I'm incapacitated. And if it says that, then usually in the fine print, it will say how that incapacity is to be determined, like my regular doctor says so in writing, or 2 independent doctors attest to it. So it's actually also a really important issue in terms of, do you have the legal tool, available to you to step in and assist your parent? And then we also just explained that many older adults go through this phase where capacity is not all or nothing. Lots of people go through a phase where it's kind of, borderline or in a gray area. It's also technically supposed to be considered for a specific decision. So you might have the capacity to make an easy decision, like what you want to have for lunch, but not a complicated one, like should you get a reverse mortgage? And what I've found, and you may know this, Paula, but the American Bar Association has a wonderful commission on law and aging. And a few years ago, they came out with a handout, a PDF that was top 10 legal tips for family caregivers. And the #1 tip was understand the concept of decisional capacity. But then they didn't really offer a lot of resources on how to learn about that. And when I've looked online, there's actually not a lot for the public to understand this. So, so first I wrote an article about it on Better Health While Aging a few years ago, but then we did include it in the book. And again, it's supposed to be an introduction, so you can start thinking a little bit about this concept, not so that you can, you know, decide definitively for your parent on your own. You should definitely get professional assistance if you're concerned about your parent's capacity.
So all these steps are very clarifying. And then we come to the part of the book that's taking action,
Yeah.
creating an actionable plan. And we go through lots of specifics on how to make that happen. But it sounds simple, but of course it's challenging. What do you most want people to kind of know about this stage of that they wanted to do, you know, 4 steps ago and leap in and do something?
Yeah. I mean,
About this
I
now?
think what's most important to know is, you know, one, there's often no exact right next step. And so in doing this book, we tried to create a framework that people could follow to figure out what might be reasonable next steps for their situation. Because otherwise, all the families and circumstances are so variable that I can't tell anyone without being closely involved in their situation, you know, what to do. And so we were trying to kind of give people a framework to figure out what their next steps might be. And then the other thing, and so this was one of Paula's innovations. We turned it into like an ABC DE formula. And we have a worksheet for that to help you kind of review everything you learn from observing, talking to your parent, from what would be reasonable next steps, you know, given the circumstances and, you know, what's feasible. But the other thing we really emphasize is that you're going to come up with a, you know, a next step, and that it's probably not going to work the first time you try it. And we really wanted to emphasize that to people, that the nature of, and I have found this, you know, with patients, with, you know, elder care, you know, and going to house calls, is that it often takes a few tries to figure out either the conversation or approach that helps the older person take a next step, or it might take a few tries to get the doctor to help you in the way you want. I mean, often, you know, I've been hearing from families for over 10 years, often initially they don't get the help that ideally the doctor would be providing on the first try. And so it might take some persisting there. And so we find, you know, and I work a lot with geriatric care managers too, that often you have to try a few times and kind of learn from that and be like, and so in the book, we refer to it as experimenting. So you try it one way, I'm like, well, that didn't, you know, let me adjust it and try it a little different way. Because if you go in expecting that, well, I can make a plan and just talk to the doctor or talk to my parent once and bang, we'll be done, you're going to be sorely disappointed. And so again, I encourage people to think of this as, you know, you're there to keep trying in thoughtful ways, not to get the medal, you know, or the pelt or the piece quickly. And honestly, I wish it were easier, frankly. I think it's kind of a, you know, a scandal that as a society, we still, so many people go through this, so many older adults, so many adult children, so many families, and it's still often a lot more work than I think it should be. But we wanted to let people know that if you have to try several times, it's not that you did it wrong. You know, it's just that this is the nature of what people go through right now.
Yeah, that it's seldom a one and done. And you used the word journey earlier, that it is this long journey that you're a companion for, and sometimes require a lot of action, sometimes requires a lot of listening, sometimes requires a lot of experimenting, sometimes everything's great for a while, but it's a long, it tends to be a long, it's your relationship, but it's a long relationship, and so this part of that relationship can go on and morph. I put this slide up here just so that you could see there's an article on Dr. Leslie's website that's just a free article that kind of is a longer version of the kinds of things that we've been talking about here. And so you can get more of that kind of information. And then, of course, the book itself describes all these kinds of things that we talked about. And did you want to mention sort of once you know that you maybe have a parent who's dealing with
Yeah.
loss?
Yes. Yeah. So for anyone who knows their parent has memory loss, or maybe, even a diagnosis of something affecting their memory or their cognition, I am presenting a new free workshop this Thursday that is going to be specifically about addressing safety issues in parents with memory loss. And so I have been offering these Helping Older Parents online programs for about 3 years. The first one was called the Helping Older Parents Bootcamp. And then we had a membership, and it's for people anywhere on the journey. But what I noticed was a lot of people's parents, not everybody, but for a lot of people, their parent did have a memory or thinking problem, or even a diagnosis of dementia or Alzheimer's. And so the book was really kind of designed to help people who may not be sure, because often people aren't sure what's normal or not normal. And this upcoming workshop will be focused more on, well, if they definitely do have memory loss, let's talk about some specific ways that you want to communicate with them, some specific approaches that you might have to take to address safety issues such as driving. So that's free, and that's on Thursday for anyone who is interested. And I think now we'd be happy to take questions from the audience.
Wow, that was jam-packed. Thank you so much, both of you. And I do have some questions that I'd like to funnel your way.
Great.
First of all, for people who are listening to the recording, that will be Thursday, June 24th, 2021. So if you're listening to the recording later, go to her website, go to Leslie's website, and find out about any other events that she has later. You talked about ethically permissible earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Could you speak a little bit more to that? When is ethically permissible okay?
Yeah, so it's interesting because there's a lot in the medical literature about the ethics of decision-making capacity related to consenting to medical trials, and treatment. And so far, I found very little on the ethics of family members starting to intervene when parents may be reluctant to. But in general, if the principle of autonomy, is that we let adults make decisions about their own life and health, unless they're, endangering others, but or unless we think that they have lost the mental capacities to really understand the implications of the situation and of their choice. And if it seems like they may not have capacity, then it becomes, ethically permissible to push forward on potentially, not letting them make a choice and starting to intervene more. And so, in practical terms, what families often do, and also geriatric care managers and people in, facilities, is even when people have not been declared incapacitated or incompetent in court, is that if we think they don't understand, then they, potentially start maneuvering around them. So this is definitely like, I think this is a little bit fraught as territory. I think that's actually why not a lot of doctors and academics want to go on the record about it. And I always tell people that it's, it's really like your last resort, right? But we do talk about this in the book, that if you think your parent, if there are signs that your parent is slipping and really doesn't understand the risks that around them, then it's ethically more permissible to not tell the whole truth,
Right.
And certainly if the person ends up developing something like a dementia, that's fairly routine in care, is to fudge the truth when it seems necessary for the better well-being of the person. So another example of ethically permissible is the HIPAA laws. Actually, we have an article about HIPAA. People think, so first of all, people think they can't tell their parent's doctor about the problems they're seeing because their parent doesn't want them to. So, family caregivers are not covered entities under HIPAA. They can tell the doctor whatever they want. Now, the doctor can't necessarily tell them. And then also, you know, it's not illegal to tell your parent's doctor something that your parent didn't want you to. It's certainly a, you know, an ethics question and a relationship question, right? So you don't want to do it lightly, but and this is again why we gave people these cognitive symptom checkers, you know, not that they can make a diagnosis by themselves, but you know, I can, you know, it sort of lists like things that are not normal, and if you're seeing enough of them, you know, and when you ask your parent about the fender bender, they're like, what fender bender? I didn't do it. You know, you can start to think, well, maybe they're really not seeing the situation, and in that case, it's a little ethically more permissible for me to, you know, take some steps forward, even if they don't want me to. But to come back to HIPAA, the HIPAA rules actually say that a health provider can disclose information to other people if they think the patient has impaired capacity to consent to the disclosure, and if they think it's in the best interest of the patient. So when doctors are like, oh, no, I can't do it because they're, you know, they didn't give me permission. I mean, there's a little bit more to it. Now, a lot of providers are not aware of that and are uncomfortable doing it. And, you know, really, if as a provider, you're going to make that kind of disclosure, ideally, you would have documented in your notes, you know, why you thought the person was impaired and might not, you know, be able to consent to it, which is why we talk in the book about, here's all the things you should tell the doctor about, right? Because the doctor is not going to know all these problems your parent is having unless you tell them.
Right.
You know, because often an older person who is slipping cognitively is fairly unlikely to bring it up to the doctor. I mean, some of them do, but, you know, a lot of them do not.
I actually think one of the good tips that you give is that you can send the provider, if you're in that situation and you're really concerned and want them to have that information, that you can very concisely convey that information in written form and get that to the provider in advance of the appointment, so that they've got it there and they've got the notes and have a, you know, have your perspective on what's going on, and that can be a helpful tool. And we offer an example to show.
Yeah, a sample letter. We actually, in the book, we built in 2 sample families who kind of demonstrate what it looks like to implement every chapter of the book. And so one of the families does end up making an additional push to notify the health provider, because the first time they do it, it doesn't really work. The provider's like, oh, he's fine, which happens with health providers who've known the person for a long time. And many older people actually will socially present really well in front of their provider. This is something I've heard from, you know, family members all the time. She does great in front of the doctor, but then at home there's, you know, this and that. So yes, you can, you know, provide information. Now, I have heard from families. So often if you provide that information to the doctor and ask for their discretion and say that, you know, you've tried to like mention it to your parent and you've seen your parent get very upset and defensive about it, and you know, so you want to make them aware, and perhaps they can be discreet, you know, because the doctor doesn't have to say, oh, your child told me this or that. The doctor could just make note of that and be like, maybe next time they come in, I'll ask them a few extra questions to see for myself whether it seems like their cognition is okay or not. Now, we have had some families, it works for some families, but some families tell us, well, it was terrible because the doctor just told my parent right away, your child, you know, sent me this or that. And I'm really sorry if that happens. We can't always control what they will do, but you know, if you always sit there waiting for your parents' permission, that's not always going to work out. So if you, I mean, the best is to try first, see how they feel about it. Could I go with you? See if you can frame mentioning it as a way to you know, less threatening. Like nobody wants to hear, let's go get you in to get you checked for your memory and make sure you're not developing Alzheimer's. But it could be, well, you know, I heard that it can be fairly common for certain medications to make memory a little worse. And I know it's really important for you to keep living here. And I'd love to know we're doing everything we can to just keep you at your best. So how about we go in and ask the doctor about it? So, and that's something we talk about in the book too, is once you hear what's important, you want to frame your suggestions as ways to help them get something they said was important to them. And you want to downplay the part that is going to be alarming. Like, let's make sure it's not time for you to move into a nursing home. People hate that. Don't ever say that.
You know, speaking of family scenarios, one of our attendees is asking a question, or really just, I think, speaking about a scenario that she's dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
She's a professional. She has on her social work hat often to assess her dad.
Mm-hmm.
But he becomes very angry and defensive, understandably. His memory has declined noticeably, as well as his hearing loss in the past several years. And
Mm-hmm.
she can deal with a client's anger in a way that she cannot with her dad. She doesn't
Mm-hmm.
engage, but he can be very verbally abusive and belligerent. He does function independently. But as his daughter, you know, she just doesn't want to deal with it, and that makes her feel guilty. So
Mm-hmm.
this book is going to be helpful for professionals and caregivers and people who are both. Can you speak a little bit about the guilt that caregivers feel in terms of that kind of scenario?
Yeah. So we have had a lot of health professionals in the Helping Older Parents programs. And so it's always different when it's your own family. I mean, it's certainly a huge advantage to have that background and knowledge, and it's different with our own families. Um, so so I think it's also, and we have like a fourth section of the book, Getting Ready for the Longer Journey, you know, where we talk about how important it is to connect yourself with sources of support, because it's often harder than we think it should be based on our background, and then we carry that guilt, and it can be hard to let that go without other people to you know, help us reframe it and help us release it. So I've had a lot of people over the years talk about how they feel so alone, which is just such a shame, because there are literally millions of people in this situation, you know, in the country. But so sometimes getting, you know, a little help from a support group, but sometimes it means, you know, even though we feel like, well, I should be able to handle this, just like I feel like I should be able to handle my family's medical problems. I'm a doctor. Sometimes it's recognizing that maybe I need to let someone else come in and help. Maybe it would be a good investment to find another professional who could, you know, have some conversations with my dad or me, or mediate. Because this is often harder than we think it will be. And then I always tell people, don't stay alone. You know, find places to vent those feelings, because especially if our parent is slipping, we want to present a really supportive front, and it is exhausting for us because we have our own roiling emotions. Did you want to add something to this, Paula?
Well, I know I was just thinking at the beginning, you were describing the parallels as a practice between geriatrics and pediatrics. And
Mm-hmm.
certainly the patient population is very different, but the word guilt coming up reminds me
Mm-hmm.
of a long time in the writing in the parenting world. And I think whenever a family is involved, guilt is such a pervasive emotion, no matter what you do. And it's kind of helpful to separate out, is it good guilt, constructive guilt, or bad guilt, right? Bad guilt, you just beat yourself up because you're not doing enough, you'll never do enough. You know, good guilt is sort of motivates you, is galvanizing. Okay, I'm feeling this because something's not right. Therefore, let me seek out these resources of the kinds that you were just describing.
Yeah.
I had not really thought about that parallel in that way
Right.
just now, but
And that's also why we try to help, you know, reframe the outcome, right? Like, well, okay, it's really hard. Maybe what you can do for him is sit and let him be angry, you know? So there's another book I really like called How to Cope with Your Difficult Older Parents by Barbara Kane. And we have a podcast interview with her. And she talks about how, you know, one thing she finds a lot of adult children need to do is get better at accepting their parents' unhappiness, right? We want them to be happy. And so, you know, we go talk to them and they start complaining, and we try to help them see things on the bright side. That is actually not really listening and validating. And again, you know, a group or talking to someone else can help, can reframe like, well, are you beating yourself up because you couldn't get this or that, or you couldn't get him to be happy, you know, and reminding you that, well, what you can do is just be there and be a sympathetic ear, you know, and go to your support group where everyone can say, and yes, it is really hard to hear them rant and complain after everything I tried to do for them and they don't even see it, you know. Yeah, I definitely feel for the person who wrote in, and I think all of this is much easier said than done. So we have provided some direction because I would like for people to not be bushwhacking, flailing around trying to figure it out as much as they do. But even with a direction, it's usually not an easy road. And I have felt bad about that I haven't been able to make it as easy for people as I would like. But then I tell myself, well, you can only do what you can do, right? That's true for our parents, for life. So this is what I feel like I can do, even though I can't make it as easy for families as I would like to. And, you know, every adult child is going to be in that role too. Usually we cannot achieve nearly as much for our parent as we wish we would. And we have to find some acceptance and grace.
Take your own medicine.
Yeah, any final words? We're at the end of our time, but this has been really enlightening.
Yeah, no, I would just love to thank you again for inviting us and for the attendees for being with us. And also if people have more questions, I usually do like 30 to 60 minutes of Q&A after my own workshops. So I'd be happy to take, you know, a question Thursday. I guess we're starting at 4. So, you know, at that event for anyone else who wants to ask a question about what they heard today or about helping parents with memory loss.
Okay, well, we're going to stop the recording as soon as Paula does. And I want to thank you both for being here, as well as everyone else for attending.
Okay. Oh, and just briefly, I see in the chat, someone said, I'd like to take the Thursday class, but can't register. That was from Lori. You know, Lori, on the site, there's a contact thing where you can write to support@betterhealthwhileaging.net, and we can look into that. We've had a lot of people register today, but we'll figure out what's going on with that. Okay. Thank you again, Caitlin.